The Great Barrier Reef is the world's largest coral reef system, composed of 2,900 individual reefs and 900 islands stretching over 2,300 kilometers. Located off the coast of Queensland, Australia, the reef is the world's biggest single structure made by living organisms and can be seen from outer space. Unfortunately, the reef is severely threatened by climate change. Why should we care? Because without it, our marine ecosystems would collapse, having massive knock-on effects on the global economy. One organization working hard to protect and revive this ecosystem is the Great Barrier Reef Foundation. Join Carolyn Trewin, a program manager at the foundation, as she elaborates upon the great work being done by the organization. As always, 30% of the revenue generated from this episode through paid subscriptions on Substack will be donated to conservation organizations like the Great Barrier Reef Foundation. So, welcome, Carolyn, to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on today to talk about the Great Barrier Reef.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited that we can share, with the audience more about the Great Barrier Reef Foundation today.
So, what got you interested in working in conservation and specifically coral reefs?
Well, I spent a lot of my childhood visiting and exploring the east coast of Australia, including the bush and the beach. And so my interest in nature, it began from a very early age. And I was particularly inspired to work in marine science and conservation after learning to scuba dive in 1998. I don't know if you've been under the water in this, but, until you've put yourself in there and immersed yourself, there's just sort of no other way to fully appreciate what it has to offer. So it's a pretty special place. And so a few years later, I found myself studying marine science on the Southern Great Barrier Reef. And, once you've been there, you just can't wait to go back. And so I've since dedicated my career to working in roles that help these magnificent reefs and hopefully preserve them for future generations.
What was the idea behind the Great Barrier Reef Foundation?
Well, the Great Barrier Reef Foundation, we were established 26 years ago in response to the first mass coral bleaching event, which occurred in 1998. And this unfortunately devastated many reefs and it killed 1 in 12 of the world's corals. And so our goal here at the foundation is to create a better future for coral reefs, by providing financial and practical support. We are an independent not-for-profit entity, and so all of our funding and activities, they're all directed to supporting projects that protect and restore the Great Barrier Reef. We're very collaborative, so we work in close partnership with traditional owners of the reef here in Australia, local communities, researchers and business and governments as well. And we invest in a range of activities that protect the ocean habitats, restore the reefs, and help the communities that depend on them become more resilient to the impacts of climate change.
So, what makes the Great Barrier Reef so special?
So many things. It's a beautiful place. It's one of the most biodiverse places and complex ecosystems on the planet. It is the largest living structure on Earth that can be seen from space. It's the size of Italy or Japan, the country, and it's equivalent to, I think, the size of 70 million football fields. So it's enormous. It's, our tropical coral reefs, they occupy less than 1% of the Earth's surface, but they're actually home to at least a quarter of all marine life. So they provide sanctuaries for wildlife and many migratory and threatened species, as well as providing feeding and breeding grounds for a lot of marine life as well. Our reef, it's comprised of more than 2.4 million hectares of reef, and comprised in there is over 3,000 individual reefs, and they support more than 600 types of corals and more than 1,600 fish species. So it's incredibly diverse. So the Great Barrier Reef is of deep cultural significance to Australia's First Nations people. who have been caring for land and sea country for more than 60,000 years. The reef, it also protects our coastline from storms and provides jobs for local communities, and it offers enormous opportunity for recreation and tourism as well. So there are just so many things that make the Great Barrier Reef really special, and I would encourage the listeners, if they ever can get here, to come and visit the reef. It's beautiful.
What role does Great Barrier Reef have in tackling the climate crisis?
The climate crisis, biodiversity crisis, yes. So, I mean, coral reefs, including the Great Barrier Reef, are essential for keeping our planet healthy. It plays a vital role in food security and sustaining coastal livelihoods, including supporting fisheries and tourism. Its role in tackling the climate and biodiversity crisis is really connected to the coastal habitats like seagrass and the mangrove forests and wetlands. And these areas, they provide essential marine habitat, not only for the threatened species, but they also filter the water that flows from the land through to the reef. But they have another critical job, and that is mitigating climate change by storing carbon. And these sites, they do this naturally by helping to reduce the impact of greenhouse gases. And they act like an enormous sponge and a highly effective carbon sink by absorbing and storing the atmospheric carbon. And so this is also known as blue carbon. And the Great Barrier Reef is actually one of the world's most powerful blue carbon sites. So terrestrial ecosystems, such as rainforests, they also do this. They store carbon too, but the oceans and our reef ecosystems supercharge the process, storing carbon 30 to 50 times more efficiently than the forests can. And so the reef, plays an important role for many reasons. And it's really important that it's conserved and, that we help these sort of special habitats that help combat climate change, that we help protect those.
Talk about the crown-of-thorns starfish and why they are a threat to coral reefs.
Crown-of-thorns starfish, we call them cots for short. They're the world's largest starfish, and they can be pretty nasty, and they're kind of ugly. If you look one up and have a look at what they look like, they are big. They grow up to nearly 1 meter in diameter. They have a lot of arms. They can have up to 21 arms. They have hundreds of toxin-tipped thorns, so they're very spiky critters. And the thorns, they're venomous, so to people and to marine life as well. And unfortunately, they have an appetite for coral. So they eat coral, they prey on nearly all types of coral, and they can eat their way through over 10 metres squared of corals a year. And they do this in an interesting way. They actually extrude their stomachs out from their bodies to wrap it around the corals and then digest their tissues. It's pretty nasty. And, they do occur naturally on the Great Barrier Reef, but the problem is when they outbreak in the millions. So think equivalent to a locust plague on land and in agriculture. And in the reefs, they can eat up to 90% of corals when they have an outbreak. They can also lay more than 200 million eggs a year, and so the impact is quite significant. They're also tough. They're very tough, like most starfish. If they lose an arm, a cot can actually regrow a new arm in around 6 months. And lastly, a cot's adult can live up to 9 months without eating at all, so they're pretty resilient.
What exactly is the El Nino and what impact does it have on the Great Barrier Reef?
El Nino, it's a climatic event and it's characterised by the periodic warming of sea surface temperatures across the Pacific Ocean. And so in Australia, this typically brings hot, drier weather and reduced cloud cover. And so then this leads to the risk of increased droughts, bushfires and heat waves, both on land and at sea, which can cause coral bleaching. And El Nino summers, they're of great concern for the health of our Great Barrier Reef, as the higher than average ocean temperatures, that's what leads to mass coral bleaching events, disrupting the entire reef ecosystem.
Talk a bit more about coral bleaching and the impacts of climate change.
Sure. The big one, climate change. It's the greatest threat facing the reef, and the key impact being the rising temperatures. Obviously, as we discussed earlier, primarily by the increased atmospheric carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. And So, the growing combination of rising water temperatures along with more severe weather events, including cyclones and flooding, plus impacts to water quality are some of the climate-induced threats putting pressure on the reef. But coral bleaching, like you just mentioned, that's the key impact. And when corals suffer heat stress, they have microscopic algal cells in them and they expel those when they're under stress. And this exposes their white skeletons, which is what we call the bleaching. And so these bleached corals, they're highly stressed, but they may not be dead. They're usually not dead. They're just more at risk of starvation and disease. So they can recover from coral bleaching over time, but only when those external stresses are reduced. And if it happens quickly enough, such as if the sea surface temperatures come back down quickly enough for them to recover. Yeah, and unfortunately, the marine heat waves have triggered all mass coral bleaching events on the Great Barrier Reef in just the last 7 years. The other one I think is to touch on maybe is ocean acidification. So the ocean is a fantastic sequester of atmospheric carbon, and the oceans capture around 20% of our carbon emissions. And the process of ocean acidification is where over time, the increased atmospheric carbon is changing the chemistry of the seawater and it makes it more acidic. And so this in turn makes it harder for the corals to maintain their structures and build their calcium carbonate skeletons, and then they are more vulnerable to damage from things like storms and disease as well.
So, what are some of the other threats to coral reefs?
Other threats. There are a range of those across the world, at our coral reefs across the world, including, poor water quality, which I've mentioned already. Unsustainable fishing practices is another one. Disease, marine debris, coastal development in many areas, and also, of course, pollution. And on the Great Barrier Reef, poor water quality is one of the key threats to the reef. The land-based runoff increases the amount of fine sediments and nutrients on the reef and in the reef's waters. And so while this would occur naturally after rainfall events, human activities have greatly increased the amount and changed the type and nature of the inputs. And so the impacts of that, they vary in extent and severity depending on the ecosystem and the distance of that from the coast.
How do you predict threats like coral bleaching?
Great question. And that's, exactly what we need to know in order to try and help the reef. So predicting where, when, and why coral bleaching and other disturbances will occur on the reef is so important. This information, knowing this, it guides our decisions about the reef's conservation and its management. And so how we collect data and what it tells us is a critical part of protecting the reef. And the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park is one of the best managed reef ecosystems in the world. And so we're all sort of working together, researchers, traditional owners, tourism, governments and community to monitor the health of the reef. And these efforts to collect information on the conditions that cause corals to become stressed is, used. So we use monitoring and modelling in combination to create forecasting models. And we input data, so historical and current data we use to make informed estimations of future conditions on the reef. And this helps us understand what responses are likely to occur. And we use satellite technology, we use powerful models and machine learning. They all help us to predict when the combined impact of a certain type of conditions on coral reefs is more likely to cause impacts like widespread bleaching. I suppose also we can, predict, sort of looking at reef hotspots, the areas most at risk, to see, where they might be and what the impacts might be from major rainfall and weather events on water quality, and also even where and when the next crown-of-thorns outbreak, starfish outbreak might occur.
So, how do you restore coral reefs after they have been degraded and a bleaching event? And talk about some of the work your foundation is doing to restore the Great Barrier Reef.
Sure, yeah. The restoration and the work we're doing, that's one of the biggest things that we would like to figure out. And the scale of the problem, it's big. So this means we really need to develop technology that can restore and revive reefs in new ways. We have a reef restoration and adaptation program that is the largest research and development effort of its kind. And some of the work, that we're doing under there, the coral IVF, that's one approach we're using to help the reef recover after bleaching events. So this is where the researchers, they capture excess sperm and eggs from the corals on healthy reefs, and they rear millions of baby corals in specially designed facilities. And then when, reefs have been impacted, we have the ability to return baby corals back to the reef that have been impacted and helping repopulate them and offering hope for restoration. Obviously, heat-tolerant coral species are targeted for such efforts, so hopefully within time they can stand warmer temperatures better. Some other things we're doing is using cryopreservation technologies to preserve coral species. So this is where we keep frozen coral cells alive. Coral sperm, coral eggs and larvae are stored in secure chambers of liquid nitrogen where they can be kept indefinitely. And then, if they're needed for future reef restoration efforts, they can be used then. And this is really serving as a backup plan to help preserve coral biodiversity and protect species from extinction and allowing us to reintroduce corals to damaged parts of the reef. Unlocking the blue carbon potential is also an important way we're helping to mitigate the severity of climate change impacts on the reef. We spoke earlier about the ways in which coastal habitats store carbon, and so protecting these areas is really critical. The Great Barrier Reef, it supports the largest seagrass ecosystem on the planet, with more than 3.5 million hectares of seagrasses accounts for about 11% of the world's seagrass. And so we're building Australia's first dedicated seagrass nursery facility. And so that is there to hopefully supply more than 1 million seeds that will go towards helping restore degraded seagrass meadows within the reef's waters as well. Restoring island habitats is another one. So we have, on the Great Barrier Reef, we have more than 1,000 reef islands and over 2,000 kilometres of coastal wetlands. And a couple of examples from these programs is on Lady Elliot Island on the southern Great Barrier Reef, where our efforts have increased critical turtle nesting habitat by 125%. And we've also restored the world's largest green turtle nesting site on Rain Island. So, supporting the survival of turtle hatchlings and their nesting sites for the future. And so our goal for 2030 is to empower frontline communities on the reef with strategies and technologies. And part of this is to deploy 10 million heat-tolerant corals annually across 100 priority reefs on the Great Barrier Reef. And we're also now looking to extend our efforts into the Pacific as well.
Talk about the Reef 2050 plan and the Reef Trust Partnership.
The 2050, it's called the 2050 Long-Term Sustainability Plan, and the Reef 2050 Plan for short. And this is Australia's overarching strategy to improve the health and resilience of the reef. The plan provides an overarching long-term strategy for managing the reef, and so coordinating actions to guide management through to 2050. It focuses on a few key areas, those being limiting the impacts of climate change to reduce the impacts from land and water-based activities. It hopes to influence the reduction of international sources of impact, as well as protecting, rehabilitating and restoring the reef.
So what have been some of the most prominent challenges you have faced at the organization?
Challenges for me? Well, I suppose as a marine scientist and someone who is really passionate about the environment, I think I mentioned earlier, I've dedicated my career to working in roles that make a difference. And so aligning my aspirations of supporting ecosystems and communities and things like that, I'm passionate about the oceans. So seeing the impacts of climate change and being at the forefront of that is quite confronting and can be challenging, but it is this challenge that also inspires me to work harder and to keep at it.
And what about the best moments?
Some of the best moments from my work. I think getting to visit, many incredible locations across Australia and abroad. So, I've travelled and worked in some of the most southern parts of Australia up to the top of the country. But I think some of the most memorable moments are those spent diving and snorkeling on the Great Barrier Reef and visiting and working on some of the reef's incredible islands as well, such as Lady Elliot, Heron Island and Green Island. Seeing turtles laying their eggs and hatchlings emerging from their nests is pretty special too. And recently I was fortunate to spend time with our amazing partners in Belize, and visiting this beautiful country and being immersed in the culture and way of life is, just incredible. I think snorkeling with the manatees was definitely a highlight during that visit as well.
So that was the final question I had for you today. Thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure speaking to you.
No worries. Thank you so much for having me. Great to have the opportunity to talk to you today.